Picture a world where the sound of screaming never truly stops, where men, women and children learn to recognize the distinctive crack of iron-tipped spears against city gates, the way others might recognize birdsong, where survival depends not on strength or cunning, but on pure, arbitrary luck. Whether the Assyrian army marched north this season or south, whether your city surrendered quickly enough, whether you possessed a skill valuable enough to spare your life. Between the 10th and 7th centuries BCE, the Assyrian Empire transformed the ancient Near East into a landscape of perpetual fear, where terror was not a byproduct of conquest, but its primary weapon. The Assyrians were not simply brutal conquerors. They were architects of a system so ruthlessly efficient that it would take centuries for the world to see its equal. From their heartland in northern Mesopotamia, along the banks of the Tigris River, they constructed the largest empire the ancient world had yet witnessed, stretching from the mountains of modern-day Turkey to the deserts of Egypt, from the Mediterranean coast deep into Persia. But size alone did not make their empire exceptional. What set the Assyrians apart was their systematic use of calculated terror as state policy, their transformation of warfare into an annual ritual of conquest, and their willingness to inflict suffering on a scale that shocked even their contemporaries. Relentless warfare, constant battles with no safe haven. The Assyrian military machine never stopped. Before Tiglath-Pileser III's reforms in the 8th century BCE, Assyrian armies were seasonal forces, consisting primarily of farmers who fought between spring planting and fall harvest. But Tiglath-Pileser transformed this system entirely. He created the ancient world's first true professional standing army, soldiers who trained year-round, received regular pay, and whose only occupation was war. This change was revolutionary. It meant the Assyrian Empire could launch campaigns at any time of year, could maintain multiple armies in different regions simultaneously, and could conduct the prolonged sieges that had previously been impossible with seasonal troops. King Shalmaneser III, who ruled before these reforms, had campaigned for 31 years of his 35-year reign. But even he could not match what came after. With a professional army, Assyrian kings conducted annual campaigns. Every single year, without fail, the army marched out to conquer new territory, suppress rebellions, or simply raid already conquered peoples for tribute. For subject peoples, this created an unbearable situation. You might surrender to the Assyrians, accept their governors, pay their tribute, and follow their laws. Yet still, each spring, you would watch Assyrian armies march through your territory, requisitioning supplies, taking able-bodied men as conscripts, extracting additional tribute beyond what had already been paid. The Assyrians called this receiving tribute, but for subject peoples it felt like perpetual robbery backed by overwhelming force. The military infrastructure supporting this constant warfare was unprecedented. The Assyrians built roads throughout their empire, not for commerce, but for moving troops rapidly. They established supply depots along these routes, stockpiling food and equipment so armies could campaign far from the Assyrian heartland. They developed an intelligence network that would not be matched until the Persian Empire, with spies and informants reporting on potential rebellions before they could organize. When King Esarhaddon captured the Egyptian capital of Memphis in the 7th century BCE, he claimed to have taken it in less than a day, testimony to the refined efficiency of Assyrian siege tactics. The constant state of warfare created a society where military service was universal among men. All Assyrian males were expected to serve, and subject peoples were conscripted in massive numbers. This meant that for civilians throughout the empire, there was no safe distance from violence. Your sons, brothers and fathers would be taken to fight Assyrian wars. Your crops and livestock would feed Assyrian armies. Your labor would build Assyrian fortifications. And any sign of resistance or reluctance would bring the full weight of Assyrian military power down upon your city. Between campaigns, there was no peace. The empire faced constant rebellions from subject peoples who, seeing no other option, chose to fight, even knowing what defeat would mean. The Babylonians rebelled repeatedly, despite being crushed with horrific violence each time. Cities in Syria and the Levant formed coalitions, hoping that united they could resist what they could not defeat alone. But the professional Assyrian army, with its iron weapons, sophisticated siege equipment, and cavalry forces, defeated every challenge. The Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE saw the Assyrians face a coalition of forces, including thousands of chariots and infantry. The Assyrians claimed victory and continued their expansion. Public punishments: what happened to those who disobeyed? Punishment in the Assyrian Empire was never private. It was theatre, staged for maximum psychological impact. When a city rebelled against Assyrian rule, the response followed a predictable pattern that made examples of the defeated. The Assyrian army would arrive and offer terms, surrender immediately and receive relatively lenient treatment, or resist and face total destruction. Those who chose resistance learned that Assyrian threats were never empty. After the siege ended, the city's leaders would be brought before Assyrian commanders for public execution. Flaying was reserved for kings and high officials. This fatal method of skin removal performed while crowds watched, the removed skin then displayed on walls or poles as a permanent warning. Common soldiers and fighters faced execution by impalement, iron stakes ending their lives in public view, then erected around the city so that anyone approaching would see dozens or hundreds of dying men. The civilian population faced different horrors. Women and children would be spared death, but only to be sold into slavery or deported thousands of miles from their homes. Men might be blinded through severe means, leaving them without sight to wander as living reminders of what happened to those who defied Assyria. Others suffered disfigurement and physical maiming that marked them permanently as defeated enemies. Ashurnasirpal II's inscriptions describe creating piles of executed defenders outside conquered cities, displaying the remains of those who resisted to create gruesome monuments visible from a great distance. Public torture served multiple purposes in Assyrian policy. It demonstrated the king's power over life and death. It satisfied what the Assyrians viewed as divine justice. Rebels against Assyria were rebels against the god Assur himself, and their punishment was therefore religiously sanctioned. Most importantly, it sent an unmistakable message to other cities contemplating resistance. Assyrian palace reliefs show smiling soldiers conducting these executions, archers killing fleeing enemies in retreat, warriors executing prisoners without remorse. These images were meant to be seen by foreign dignitaries, tribute bearers, and ambassadors, ensuring that word of Assyrian methods spread throughout the ancient world. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate victims. Sargon II, ruling from 721 to 705 BCE, developed additional refinements to public punishment. Prisoners would be painfully restrained and led through conquered territories bound by metal restraints, paraded as living trophies. Bodies of executed enemies were sometimes buried in mass graves in the countryside, but often they were left to rot where they fell, a feast for scavengers that could last months. The ancient historian Diodorus Siculus noted that Assyrians would severely maim living prisoners through amputation, leaving them to die slowly as spectacles for their comrades. For Assyrian subjects, the message was clear. Loyalty was not requested, it was mandatory, and disloyalty would not result in a quick death, but in prolonged suffering designed to break the spirit of anyone who might consider rebellion. The terror was so effective that some cities, hearing of the Assyrian army's approach, would execute their own leaders who had advocated resistance, sending the heads to Assyrian commanders as proof of their renewed loyalty. Survival was luck, disease, slavery, and forced deportations. Even those who survived conquest and avoided public execution faced lives shaped entirely by the whims of Assyrian policy. The most distinctive feature of Assyrian rule was their practice of mass deportation on a scale never before attempted. Between the 9th and 7th centuries BCE, historians estimate that approximately 4.4 million people were forcibly relocated throughout the empire, representing one of the largest forced migrations in human history. These deportations were not haphazard. The Assyrians carefully planned who would be moved and where they would be sent. Skilled craftsmen, scribes and priests from conquered cities would be transported to the Assyrian heartland, where their expertise could enrich the imperial capitals. Agricultural workers might be sent to recently depopulated regions, forced to cultivate lands whose previous inhabitants had been deported elsewhere. The goal was twofold: break up local identities that could organize rebellion and redistribute the empire's human resources where they would be most valuable to Assyrian interests. After Sargon II captured the Israelite capital of Samaria in 722 BCE, he deported 27,280 people to various parts of the empire, primarily to the Assyrian heartland and to Media in modern Iran. These deportees traveled hundreds of miles from their homes, often taking years to reach their final destinations. Assyrian records show that the state provided some support during these journeys. Deportees were meant to arrive in good condition so they could immediately contribute to their new regions. But the psychological trauma was immense. Families were transported together, but communities were deliberately scattered, preventing the reformation of local power structures. The biblical account of the Assyrian captivity, preserved in the books of Kings and Chronicles, provides the perspective of the deported themselves. The prophets describe populations living in terror of Assyrian aggression, knowing that defeat meant not just conquest, but the permanent loss of homeland, culture, and identity. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tel Hadid shows that Assyrian deportation policies were as thoroughgoing as the historical records suggest. Cuneiform tablets found at these sites record Babylonian and Aramean names, confirming that peoples from throughout the empire were relocated to the Levant.